Today we're going to talk about yet another one of those claims found in the Quran, the claim that Solomon was, of course, a wise man, according to the Bible, and the Quran says that he was so wise that he's given even special abilities to communicate with animals, with birds, and even with ants. And with that says, I'm going to ask Dr. J. Smith to address this.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Before we say anything, no one's suggesting that God cannot give the ability of Solomon to be able to understand ants or birds. It could. I mean, God has the power to do anything.
Absolutely.
That's certainly within His power. That's not what we're questioning here. Okay, so when Muslims are hearing us, please, that's not what we're reading. Let's go and read the text, and let's pick out a few things that I have difficulty with. It's in chapter 27 of the Quran, and we're reading verse 18 and 19. Verse 18, till when they came to the valley of the ants. So we're dealing with ants here. One of the ants said, O ants, enter your dwellings, lest Suleiman, which is Solomon, and his hosts should crush you while they perceive not. So here you have ants talking to each other. Be careful, ants. Let's get inside. Otherwise, we might be crushed by Solomon and his army as they walk across. So he, this is verse 19, Suleiman, smiled, amused at her speech, and said, My Lord, grant me the power and ability that I may be granted your favor. So here he is, he's listening to the ants, he can hear the ants speak. Now, can Solomon hear ants speak? Is that possible to do so? God in his power can do anything. The difficulty I'm having here is, what and how do ants speak? Have you ever heard an ant speak?
I mean, if we're talking whales, we know whales make noises,
Okay.
but ants, I don't know.
Do ants speak? Have you ever put your ear to the
never
ground?
heard anything.
Has there ever been any recording of ants speaking? The answer is
They
no.
signal to each other in some way or
Well,
fashion.
actually, they don't signal. There is a way that ants do communicate. And if you look at any program on ants, go on BBC. In fact, there's some great programs about the ants, enormous amount of programs, because they're such industrious little creatures. And they're moving quickly, and then they all of a sudden stop, and then they
right.
actually, their heads come together. And what are they doing? They're not talking. Notice what they're doing. They're antennas.
And the antennas touching each other.
And what are they doing? They're exchanging pheromones, chemical. There's no noise whatsoever. The only noise you're hearing is their feet hitting the ground. And that can be picked up, but that's not communication. The communication is the antenna exchanging chemical pheromones. If that were the case, was Solomon given these antennae?
Yeah, I mean,
here's something I'd like to ask Muslims. How would you explain? How did he hear the ants speaking? How was he able to understand what they were saying and be able to smile unless he had either had pheromones? I'm not saying it's impossible. I just like to know how this was done. And I think what was happening here is if my sons love to watch cartoons, and there's a beautiful cartoon about ants. And you can see the ants on the ground, and they're yelling out loud. And you can imagine even when you look and observe an ant, you could assume that they're talking to each other, because though they're so small, I can imagine a man would think that ants spoke. In 7th century, this would be quite normal. So that it could be quite normal that God would give them the ability to be able to pick up what they were saying in whatever language. We now know today that's not how it happens. It doesn't happen through any noise or any type of vocal communication. There's no sound waves. It is all through chemical exchange.
Absolutely. And I mean, this incident would have taken place around the reign of Solomon, about 1,000 years before the time of Christ. Nowhere in the Old Testament, for instance, did it talk about such a special gifting that was given to Solomon. I mean, we read about a lot of strange, things that happened, basically. Why would God hide something like this from us? He could have said, I granted him that, power to be able to...
Could I exchange? And I tell you where I think this comes from?
Yeah.
If you look at chapter 27, almost the entire story of Solomon, because he doesn't only talk to ants, he also talks to a bird,
right?
The hoopoe bird.
That's right.
Name known as the hoopoe bird because of hoopoe, hoopoe. Mm-hmm. That story of the hoopoe bird and Solomon that story, along with the ants, and also everything that the hoopoe bird does, flies down to Sheba, meets the Queen of Sheba, who talks to him as well. So here, both the Queen of Sheba can talk to birds, and Solomon can talk to birds. Well, that's a little bit more understandable because birds do make sounds, and that, you can pick that up with your ear. Anyway, she comes up with the hoopoe bird up to meet Solomon because he's too busy marching his birds, getting them ready for battle, left, right, and they fly up over the enemy and they drop stones with the name of the enemy on the bottom of the stones, and they kill the enemy that way. Now, that is, when she comes then to the court of Solomon, there, opens the door into the throne room. Solomon's sitting on his throne. She's across, comes in the door. As she's about ready to cross out, there is a pond. And she sees it, and she picks up her skirts to keep from getting wet. That's where the story ends in chapter 27, verse 44. It's from verse 17 to verse 44 you see this whole story, including the ants that we've just talked about in verse 18 and 19. Now, that story is borrowed story. That's not in your Bible. I never saw that. I would have loved to have had that story in my Bible. I missed out in Sunday school because we never had such an engaging story. And there'd be movies could have been made about this, and I would have loved those movies. The reason why it's not in the Bible is because this is an apocryphal account. This is a Jewish apocryphal account. It comes from the second Targum of Esther. Second Targum of Esther, you can go to your library, you can even pick it out. That's the source for this. That was written in the 2nd century. This book was compiled in the 7th to 8th century. The Jews that had contact with the compilers of the Quran, you notice I'm being very careful not to say Muhammad. That's why I jumped on you the other time. Whoever wrote this book had access to these stories, not to the biblical stories, for one very good historical reason. The biblical stories of Solomon, the true stories of Solomon and Sheba and all that happened in the Old Testament, had yet to be translated into Arabic. These were not translated until the 8th century. Therefore, whoever put the Quran together did not have access to the authoritative story. They just had access to the ones the Jews were giving them over the fires, the camel fires, the caravan fires at night. Those stories were apocryphal accounts. They were already translated into Arabic. That's why the Arab writers picked up these stories, like the Second Targum of Esther, written in the 2nd century. They wrote it in the 7th or 8th century. That's why you find them in Surah chapter 27.
And you know what, Jay, you gave me an idea. I know you did one time a very short video about some of the sources of stories that are found in the Quran. I think we should do a series on this. We can take one
There's
of
a whole
these.
other series we can do.
Absolutely. Because the people need to know, here is the story in the Quran. You think it's from the Bible. Guess what? Here is the source that it came from.
And this is an apocryphal account. No Jew in their right mind would go to Second Targum of Esther to say what Solomon did. Why? Ask any Jew, and they'll tell you these are nothing more than children's fables.
That's right. That's right. I mean, rabbinic teaching, Talmud, Midrash, who knows? You know,
all of these were more like children's fables. They were taught to kids like bedtime stories. But they would take these stories that they heard from as they would be traveling. Because remember, most of them were in the diaspora. They had been thrown out of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. at the destruction of the temple. They had to move out into the diaspora. They took their scriptures with them, wrapped up in their scrolls. Those they protected. They didn't let anybody read them. But what they would tell the kids at nighttime were these stories they heard. They were counting from other sources. They would take these stories and put biblical names to them.
Right.
And so Solomon was given in. But no Jew would ever tell their kids, this is what happened to Solomon. If you want to know what happened to Solomon, come back to the scrolls.
Absolutely.
Come back to this book.
And I know we're not talking about the fall, but even the story of the fall and the idea that Satan basically, the one that refused to bow down and worship Adam when he was created and caused him to stumble, and then God forgave him after the fall. I mean, there is another source for that as well.
Listen, we can go to chapter 5, the story of Cain and Abel. We know the source for that. We can go to chapter 21, verse 51 to 71, the story of Abraham in the Kaaba, destroying the idols and then being thrown into the fire pit. We know the source for that. In every one of these, you can almost see, we can pretty much look at good 70% of the biblical material in the Quran and source it back to apocryphal writings. Yep. Some of it is from the Old Testament itself.
No doubt. There is a mixture. There is some truth, but then there is other...
But these fantastic things like ants speaking to Solomon, or some able to hear the ants, that is from an apocryphal account. That comes from the Second Targum of Esther.
Absolutely. Well, as you can see, everybody, we are already making planning for a brand new series. So hold on, to until we make that announcement, because it seems that we can do a whole bunch of videos just on sources for many of these stories that are found in the Quran. But hopefully you've enjoyed this particular one, dealing with this claim that Solomon, and as my brother here mentioned, we're not really doubting that God can give those abilities to Solomon, or anyone for that matter, to communicate with birds or ants, but we're wondering, how could this be possible? What is the source for it? And therefore, we need to at least pause for a second and ask these kind of questions. So hopefully you find this yet another helpful tool in your ministry. Thank you.
Finally tonight, small talk. Very small talk. Scientists have long studied how various creatures communicate. Dolphins in the water, chimpanzees on land, birds in flight. But insects, could they possibly have anything to say? Well, when it comes to the tiny ant, it turns out the answer may be yes. Here's Nick Watt.
Ants live in highly structured societies. They are masters of architecture and even agriculture. And now, scientists tell us, ants actually talk to each other.
Were you surprised by what you found?
We were. Yes, we were surprised.
Absolutely.
With an iPod and an old pair of headphones, they discovered worker ants are indifferent to rock music, but stand guard when a distressed queen makes this particular sound.
They stand on the speaker with their jaws and their mandibles opened, something like saying, "I'm defending my queen."
Now, no one is saying these little creatures talk like they do in the movies.
Now stay calm. We are going around the leaf.
Around the leaf? I don't think we can do that.
But they do have a kind of language.
Look at the back end of the ant. That's the abdomen moving up and down, vibrating. That's how ants make noise. That's how they, I suppose, talk to each other.
Scientists made these startling discoveries by accident while studying the large blue butterfly. They watched butterfly pupae trick ants into taking them to ant nests and nurturing them until they hatched. Why? Well, amazingly, the butterfly pupae imitate the ant queen's distinctive voice. Butterflies have learned to speak this mysterious ant language, a language humans have only just discovered. Nick Watt, ABC News, Turin, Italy.
I hope you understood what they had to say. That's World News for this Tuesday. I'm Charlie Gibson, and I hope you had a good day. For all of us at ABC News, have a good night.
Human ears, the ants' world seems silent, but amplified by the microphones, the leaf comes alive with noise. And there's one particular sound we're listening for. In amongst the sounds of leaves being cut and ant footsteps is a high-pitched chirp. This is stridulation, a sound the ants make by rubbing two sections of their abdomen together. Oh, that little chirp?
Yeah.
There.
Yeah. So they're making this sound, but it's part of a group of sounds that they make, these stridulation sounds.
That little chirping noise is a recruitment signal. The more nutritious a leaf is, the more the ant makes this noise, sending a cascade of vibrations through the plant. And this draws other ants to the tastiest parts of the plant, which means the ants will tend to take the best leaves first.
Quran says in Surah Namal, chapter number 27, verse number 17 and 18, that when Solomon and his army, with hosts of men, jinns and birds, when they walked and when they approached a lowly valley of ants, one of the ants said, "O ye ant, get into the human habitations, get into your habitations, lest Solomon and his army will unknowingly trample you beneath the feet." People may think, what kind of a fairy tale book is the Quran? The ants talking among themselves? It sounds like a fairy tale book. What an old book it is, 400 years back. But today, after science has advanced, we have come to know that the animal or insect which has the closest resemblance to the lifestyle of the human being, it is the ant. The ant buries the dead the same way as the human beings do. They have a very sophisticated method of labor in which they have managers, they have foremen, they have supervisors, they have workers. They have a very sophisticated method of communication where they speak to each other. They very often meet to chat. They even have marketplaces where they exchange goods. You know how we have marketplaces, how we have souk. The ants have marketplaces where they exchange goods. And when an ant stores any grain, and if the grain begins to bud, it chops off the bud as though it knew that budding will cause rotting of the grain. And if in monsoon, in rainy season, if the grain gets wet, the ants get it out in the sunlight to dry, as though they knew that humidity will cause root system, which will cause rotting of the grain. You know, many times we see the ant taking grain and then going in the sunlight. We wonder where they're going. They're going out in the sun to dry the grain, as though they knew that humidity will cause rotting of the grain.
Top 10 awesome things you didn't know about ants. Number 10. They can stitch up wounds. Minor wounds are considered just an annoyance, with advanced medicine just a call away. However, if we were in the middle of the African savannah with no first aid kit, and the nearest help we can get is still days away, fixing that little wounds can mean life or death. Apparently, some tribes like the Maasai tribe in East Africa faced the same problem and found an easy first aid trick on the go: the army ant's strong pincers. If a Maasai warrior is out in the African bush and suffers a wound that needs stitching, all he needs to do is look for an army ant's nest and then pick out a few of the biggest ants he could find and have them bite both sides of the wound, then break off the body, leaving just the head. The seal created by the makeshift surgical staples can last for days and can be easily replaced if needed. Number 9. Before God created man, he created ants first. We all know that we, as a species, are relative newbies in the world of creation, evolving a mere 5 million years ago. Now compare that to a living fossil like the ant, who has been around since the Cretaceous period, about 110 to 130 million years ago. The age gap and the relative high social evolution of the ants may mean that only a fluke roll of the celestial dice made the difference in regards to what species came first. Number 8. They dispose of their dead. Only a few creatures on Earth treat their dead with some relative deference: humans, elephants, and, shockingly, ants. They even have undertakers to do it. When an ant dies inside the nest, they will carry the dead body outside for sanitation's sake, so that infection or disease cannot spread to the entire colony. Though any worker ant may carry the body outside, it seems there is a special ant undertaker that will usually do the cleaning up. Number 7. They can clone themselves. Parthenogenesis is a form of reproduction where there is no need for fertilization, making the resulting offspring a clone of the mother. A group of Amazonian ants was found to give birth to clones of themselves, creating a colony with no males around and somewhat echoing the legend of the fierce Amazons who do not tolerate male company. Not to be outdone, the males of the small fire ant, whose queens also practice parthenogenesis in giving birth to new queens, makes sure that their genetic legacy spreads on by cloning themselves. This special trick of the male small fire ant involves eliminating the female genome in some of the fertilized eggs, making the ant a perfect clone of the father. This unique reproductive maneuverings of both female and male small fire ants results in a nest composing of ants of the same species that has the genetic makeup of 3 completely different species: the queen clones, the male clones, and the sterile female workers with mixed genes. Number 6. They teach their young. As social insects, ants have a very advanced system going on in their colonies in order to ensure their survival. Worker ants are put into groups that does various specialized jobs like foraging, janitorial services, or caretaker of eggs and baby ants. What is surprising is that these worker ants are not born with the necessary skills already pre-programmed in their DNA to do some of these specialized works. For them to have these skills, they do what we humans do: learn it from someone who knows how things are done. The teacher ant's teaching style is called tandem running, where the teacher ant will teach a younger ant the ropes by running with it. This kind of teaching, even more surprisingly, involves a two-way interaction between teacher and student, the first in a non-human animal. If a student is a slow learner and fails in its exams, it will be relegated to some other job that does not require specialized skills. Number 5. They know how agriculture works. Among all creatures, we know of only 4 that are evolved enough to use agriculture as a means of survival: bark beetles, termites, humans, and ants. However, between ants and us, it seems they started farming first, having been at it since 50 million years ago. Before moving out of her birth nest, a young queen must first sneak inside the garden and take away some fungal pellets. These pellets will be the seedlings that she needs to start her own garden and feed her brood. Atene ants do their farming by cultivating fungi, just like humans do in farming crops. They even use pesticides to combat parasites that affect their crops. There are 5 known systems of agriculture that ants practice, but all ants that practice agriculture are shown to share some general habits in fungal gardening. Number 4. They use herbicides and disinfectant. Speaking of pesticides, ants use them, as well as herbicides, in their fungal gardens. Theirs is far more eco-friendly than ours, however. The fungal gardens that the ants grow are also home to a virulent kind of fungus that kills the fungal crops. To prevent this fungal weed from spreading, the ants have a bacteria at their disposal that they carry around on their cuticles. The bacteria produces an antibiotic that specifically suppresses the growth of the fungal weed. In their nests, they use several substances that inhibit the spread of parasites or weeds. The wood ants, for example, add solidified conifer resins to their nests while building them, which hinders the growth of bacteria and fungi. The lemon ant, which prefers to nest in trees, produces a natural herbicide that kills all other plant life surrounding their nesting tree, including grown trees. They do this by injecting leaves with herbicides, and the plants will start to die within hours. Number 3. They raise livestock. Ants do not only raise crops, but also livestock, which they use for milking. The livestock consists of insects like aphids, mealybugs, and myrmelococcus caterpillars that secrete a sweet liquid called honeydew. The ants keep the predators away from their livestock and even herd them from one feeding location to another, just like what we do with cows. When it is time to collect some honeydew from the livestock, the ants milk them by tapping them with their antennae. The ants even bring their precious livestock with them when they migrate to a new area. Kind of reminds us of frontiermen bringing their cattle along while in search of greener pastures. Number 2. They wage wars. Imagine the scene in the final battle of Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Total carnage wherever you look, with the battle lines blurred out as the warring parties are jumbled up in the heat of battle, with groups of soldiers clustering together to form a cohesive front and take out an enemy at a time. Now imagine, instead of the handsome, unsullied face of Legolas and his crew, you get ants with menacing mandibles and scary big eyes of doom. The tactics ants use in warfare are eerily similar to human war strategies, and they even vary their tactics depending on what is at stake. They can even use propaganda pheromones to confuse enemy ants and make them fight among themselves. There are even species of ants, like the Amazon ants, that oddly resembled the fabled Spartans in their way of life. Namely, they only survive through waging wars to replenish their slaves and to get more resources from other colonies. They even act like medieval knights when in their nests, doing nothing more than demanding food from their slaves and burnishing their chitinous armor. Number 1. They practice slavery. As a whole, ants are known for being hard workers, but, just like humans, there are some rotten apples in their baskets. There are several species of ants that are dependent on slave labor for survival, and who will actively wage war against other colonies to steal the pupae and enslave them upon hatching. The most rotten apple in the bunch is a species of ants called Polyergus breviceps, which, interestingly, is endemic in the United States. This species of ants have lost their ability to take care of their young and even themselves. They do not forage for food, feed the young or the queen, or even clean up their own nest. This kind of behavior would mean certain extinction for most species, but these ants have a superior weapon up their sleeve, weapons of mass subjugation. The warrior ants will attack a nest and release a formic acid against the defenders. This will trigger panic among the ranks and crumble their defenses, making it a breeze to steal the pupae. If that is not enough, they have a more formidable weapon, their queen. The queen of Polyergus breviceps is capable of releasing pheromones that will reduce the aggression of the defending ants, making them easy for conquest. In some instances, when the ants badly need more slaves, the queen will go out with the warriors to war. After releasing her pheromones to crush the aggression of the defenders, she will immediately look for the queen of the overtaken nest and kill her. Everything is not lost for the slaves, though. Every so often they stage rebellions against their masters by ripping apart the larvae of those that enslaved them. This means the slaver ants have less chance of going out and conquering more, as their numbers are quickly dwindling, thus saving other ants from slavery, one baby ant at a time.